Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bookish Babbles, the podcast where we reread our favorite books and chat about them. I'm your host, Alyson, and without further ado, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of Bookish Babbles. Today we're talking about chapters 7 to 10 of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. It's going to be a bit of a longer episode. We're breaking the pattern by talking about 4 chapters instead of 3, and the main reason I decided to do that is because chapter 10 is the end of part 1 of the book, and, it would just feel weird for me to for the following episode to cover the last part of a chapter of part 1 and then jump into part 2. So I recommend grabbing a snack because it's going to be longer than last week's episode. Hope you're all doing well. My family is watching the Super Bowl upstairs, so if you hear any background noise, that's why. And the weather's weird, of course, because I live in New England. Yesterday, which was a Saturday, it was like a little over 50 degrees and pretty warm, and now today we have a few inches of snow, so go figure. Make it make sense, New England weather. So let's not waste any more time and dive into the episode. So, quick recap from last week. Lucy Gray starts to win over some citizens with her charming personality. Coriolanus gets a demerit from Highbottom because Highbottom will find any excuse to give him a hard time, again, just like Snape does to Harry. Lucy Gray sings another song. We meet the worst woman ever, Dr. Gall. Sejanus calls out how horrible the games are, and a shocking murder happens. And with all that said, let's dive into chapter 7. Alright, so we open this chapter on a very horrifying scene, where we basically just watch Arachne die, because the last chapter ended with Brandy, the District 10 tribute, slitting her throat. And this marks the first, official death of the book that we see. And naturally, everyone starts to scream, panic when they see what happens. Coriolanus' first instinct is to recoil and back away like everyone else. But Lucy Gray tells him to help Arachne, and that snaps him back to his senses and remembers that the cameras are there, and he composes himself enough to go to Arachne's side. And then on page 100, he says, in his thoughts, not out loud, his terror was a private thing, not meant for public display, which that line just sums up, makes sense for his character, because we know that Corio doesn't like to feel out of control even for a moment, and again, that just continues to play out throughout the book. So he reaches Arachne first, calls for a medic, tries to stop the blood flow, but at that point it's kind of too late. There isn't anything he can do to save her. Brandy, meanwhile, right after murdering someone, reaches for the sandwich and gets to take one bite before peacekeepers shoot her with multiple bullets. And just like that, 2 people already dead. And as the crowd is panicking and running away, Coriolanus sees a little boy fall over, get his leg trampled. Luckily, someone pulls him out of his way, and others aren't so lucky. And this just makes me think of the earlier conversation he has with Dr. Gall and Highbottom, where when they asked him, "Oh, why are the games a thing?" And he says, "Oh, because we do it with the kids because people care about children. That's a horrible punishment." But then he wonders, do people care about children because they often get mistreated? And here it is, child getting mistreated. Yay. So anyway, Arachne dies in Coriolanus's arms. He's shaking, having violent flashbacks to the war. Lucy Gray's also having violent flashbacks, and she's shaking and even vomits. And And this tracks for me for her because later in the book, she mentions that her parents were murdered, possibly in front of her. So I can only imagine, the PTSD flashbacks that she's having. And it doesn't help that the peacekeepers are yelling at her, making the tributes line up, shout profanities at them. And as Coriolanus tries to get some of the blood off of him, he sees Sejanus sprinkle something on Brandy's body, and everyone's escorted out of the zoo. Coriolanus is joined by Festus, and both of them are obviously in shock. And Coriolanus has some inner thoughts about Arachne, and how he's never really liked Arachne very much, but he'd known her his whole life. Both were part of the old money elite in the capital, so in a way that kind of makes them family. And you don't always necessarily like your family, but family's family. Clemencia joins them, and they end up, and Coriolanus ends up walking both her and Festus home. And after he does that, he remembers the proposal is a thing. So when he goes home, he decides to write it just in case Gaul is still expecting it, because she has less empathy than anyone, even Snow. So she's very likely to expect the proposal anyway, no matter the circumstances. And he can't sleep anyway, so might as well get it done. So this is what he writes down for the proposal. Sponsors can send tributes, items in the arena, like bread, cheese, stuff like that. There should be a panel to determine the value of each item. Sponsors should be capital citizens in good standing. They can't be related to the game, so no mentors, game makers, blah, blah, blah. Another panel to determine the odds for betting and to oversee the payments. Proceeds go toward the cost of the games. And it's really interesting because we know later in Katniss's time that a lot of this does come into play. Like, obviously there are sponsors that send in items, and over the years some of the gifts that can be sent get more flashy because Finnick gets sent a Triton, and that's not a thing someone at this point would think to send into the arena. Obviously, and we do know there is a panel to determine the cost of each item, and I believe Katniss mentions as the games go on, the prices go up. And this one thing though, where in Coriolanus's original proposal, he says sponsors should be capital citizens in good standing, but we know from the original trilogy that changes because District 11 sends in bread and they give it to Katniss. So that changes over time, though people related to the games not being able to bet or send in sponsor gifts, we know that it stays because Cinna mentions that he's not allowed to bet for Katniss, but he still bets on her. God, I love Cinna. It hurts every time I read what happens in Catching Fire. Anyway, moving on. We're not there yet. Where was I? So, anyway, Coriolanus writes the proposal, works on the paper until dawn, and basically doesn't sleep all night. And after that, he figures out where to drop it off, figures the best place is the Citadel, which houses the War Department. He isn't allowed inside, of course, but the Peacekeeper takes it and promises to put it on Gaul's desk. Coriolanus sees a screen, walking down the street, showing the footage of Arachne dying and Brandy being shot. He's glad that the footage shown of him are his moments of bravery, and he's also happy to see a shot of Livia flailing her way through the crowd to get away. And even though he's somewhat emotionally scarred from everything that happened, he still relishes when Tigress and Grandmam call him a hero because he loves attention. And he kind of just feels very detached from the situation, which could be a way of processing what happens, which makes sense sometimes when when something like you witness something bad happen or something that's just unpleasant, it's natural, I think, to just especially at first because you're kind of in shock to just feel detached from everything. But he's also excited when he's told he can go to school because he's looking forward to being showered with praise for his bravery because, he likes things to be about him. And at school, he's kind of designated as chief mourner since he and Arachne were thought to be closer than they actually were, and because he was the one who tried to save her. So Satyria leads a school-wide assembly. She praises Arachne for her outspokenness, her sense of humor, and Coriolanus believes that this kind of ultimately brought about her death. And again, Arachne did not deserve what happened to her. But he does kind of have somewhat of a point. Arachne was being very dumb. And now it's time for the first tangent of the day. This one about like Arachne from Greek mythology. So that's clearly like who Arachne in this book is supposed to be named after. So Arachne in mythology is a woman who was a very talented weaver, and in most versions boasts that her skills are greater than Athena's, a literal goddess. Athena, of course, being the goddess of wisdom, battle strategy, crafts, stuff like that. And so when Arachne makes this public boast that she's better than Athena, what do you know? Athena was in the crowd disguised as an old woman, because that's what the gods do. Reveals herself, and the two have a contest to see who is truly the better weaver. Ultimately, in a lot of versions, Arachne is the winner, and the tapestry that she weaves depicts the gods in not a very flattering light, reflecting on how they, and Zeus in particular, abuses and tricks mortals. Yeah, Zeus is very, very, very guilty of that. So is Arachne wrong? But naturally, Athena did not react well to that, so she destroyed the tapestry and turned Arachne into a spider. And basically, Arachne is the first spider. And in some versions of the myth, she does so after Arachne hangs herself, and Athena partially turns her into a spider to save her life, which I thought was interesting. But the result is still the same. Arachne becomes a creature who is a weaver, but whose work is always destroyed because we humans are constantly destroying spider webs. Which, can you blame us? Those things are creepy. Yes, I'm scared of spiders. But I love Spider-Man. Am I a hypocrite? Maybe. So I just think that it's interesting that both Arachne in the myth and Arachne in Ballad, in a way, kind of contribute to their downfall. Again, not that either of them deserved what happened to them, especially Arachne in Ballad, but both had such pride in their own abilities that they failed to see the true threat that their opponent was to them. Because Myth Arachne underestimated Athena's vengeance, and same thing, Ballad Arachne underestimated Brandy's vengeance, and left a knife unattended next to a tribute who she knew was skilled at slaughtering things. And also just for having just a huge lack of empathy for her tribute as well. So again, not that Arachne deserved what happened to her, just she kind of contributed to her own downfall. Anyway, that's my tangent about Greek mythology. I just wanted to talk about that because Suzanne tends to choose character names very carefully, and there's often a meaning behind it. For example, Katniss is named after a plant, and another name for the Katniss plant is Arrowhead, which fits her because we know she's a very talented archer. But yeah, this time around reading Ballad, the meaning of Arachne's name and how she relates to the figure from mythology hit me more, and I just kind of wanted to talk about that because I thought it was cool. Anyway, moving on, because I've talked about her way more than probably anyone thought possible. Okay, so it's announced that Arachne's funeral will be the next day and it will be aired live on TV. After lunch, Coriolanus and Clemencia are summoned to the citadel. They quickly figure out that it's because of the proposal, and Clemencia is annoyed that Coriolanus wrote it without her and is also shocked that he could write it after watching Arachne die, which is fair, but, everyone deals with grief differently. Plus, Coriolanus points out that Gaul won't take any excuses because, again, she's a terrible person with no empathy. So Corio catches her up to speed a bit on the proposal and promises to cover for her if Gaul starts asking them any questions. On their way there, they wonder if the games will be cancelled and the tributes will be sent home. If only things could work out like that. Clemencia says that even if they don't get thrown into the arena, they could still be made into avoxes, which is better than dying. Coriolanus, however, is sure that Lucy Gray would rather be dead than an avox, and I would have to agree with that. I think this insight into Lucy Gray touches on a kind of underrated theme that's woven throughout the series, and that's in absence of music and art, and how without that people are more surviving than living. And later when Corio sings the national anthem at the funeral, he says that something along the lines of he isn't too worried about the quality of his voice because music hadn't really been prioritized on part of the city's daily life so much that he doesn't have much to compare himself to. Lucy Gray had kind of brought back music into Corio's life in a way. And this idea is also explored in the trilogy, and I'm really looking forward to talking about it, especially at the end of Mockingjay. And it's kind of a shame that the movies could never really touch on this theme, but I do understand why, because you obviously have to cut stuff when you're adapting a book, and I can see why that aspect of the trilogy was cut. It isn't as big of a theme as the themes of rebellion or media or the cost of war, but it is a theme that means a lot to me personally because I love music. I play I fun fact about me, I play violin, ukulele, and a little bit of guitar, and I love playing for fun and by myself, so music means a lot to me. So this theme that runs throughout the series, obviously I clocked and I love it. So, but hopefully the Ballad movie can touch on this theme just a little more, since music and singing is obviously a huge part of Lucy Gray's character. Anyway, moving on. Otherwise, this will be a 6-hour long episode, and I don't think you guys want that. So they arrive at the citadel and they're escorted underground to Gaul's lab. Corio likes it underground. He feels more protected. Big reason for this is very likely because during the air raids, he was often in his apartment, which is on the top floor of the building, and yeah, that's not the most ideal place to be during an air raid, so I can understand where he's coming from, wanting to feel protected underground. Me, on the other hand, I feel anxious underground, but that's another story. So, in the lab, Coriolanus and Clemencia, they pass by dozens of cases with various creatures inside. Some are unrecognizable, and they end up in the reptile section, where Dr. Gaul is. She's by a tank with snakes inside, and the snakes are described as being no longer than a ruler and not much thicker than a pencil. Very bright, and they're various shades of neon pink, yellow, blue, and they're all kind of twisted and tangled together and covering the whole bottom of the tank. And Coriolanus says hi to the snakes. Because, he is a snake. He's one of them. So Clemencia asks if there's a point to the snake's color, and Gaul has this line, it's on page 111, where she says, there's a point to everything or none at all, depending on your worldview. I don't really have anything else to say or add to that line. I just wanted to share because I thought it was a good line. Moving on. So Gaul confirms that she did summon them there to talk about the proposal because she liked it. Yay, good for them. And Gaul asks who wrote it. And Clementia claims that they both wrote it, and Corio backs up her story like he said he would. Says that they wrote it together and that Clementia printed it at her house, and Corio picked it up in that morning and he dropped it off. And this just a pro tip, guys, if you and a friend or friends need to lie to an adult for whatever reason, figure out your story/alibi beforehand. Work out the details first so you don't contradict or surprise each other or anything while said adult is questioning you. Gaul says she wants to ensure that they both had their hands on it, and this is when I start to feel nervous, and I was right too. Gaul asked them if they brought a copy. No, because their guards took their bags, and Corio only made one copy. So Clementia suggests that they look at the copy Coriolanus dropped off that morning. Slight problem though, it's in the snake tank. Yay. Gaul claims that one of her assistants dropped the proposal in the snake tank by accident. And I am like 99.999% sure that she put it there on purpose, because that's something she would do. And she tells them to retrieve it. Yeah, Coriolanus thinks to himself that this all feels like a test. Yeah, no kidding, buddy. He's able to get one of the pages. No problem. Yay. Clementia doesn't quite get the same results. And with that said, it's time for another reading because this is an important moment. So, starts toward the bottom of page 112. He meaning Coriolanus, he scooped his fingers under the edge of a sheet of his proposal and slowly slid it out from under the snakes. They slumped down into a heap, but didn't seem to mind much. I don't think they even noticed me, he said to Clementia, who looked a little green. Here I go, then. She reached into the tank. They can't see too well, and they can hear even less, said Dr. Gall. But they know you're there. Snakes can smell you using their tongues. These mutts hear more than others. Clementia hooked a sheet with her fingernail and lifted it up. The snake stirred. If you're familiar, if they have pleasant associations with your scent, a warm tank, for instance, they'll ignore you. A new scent, something foreign, that would be a threat, said Dr. Gall. You'd be on your own, little girl. Coriolanus had just begun to put two and two together when he saw the look of alarm on Clementia's face. She yanked her hand from the tank, but not before a half-dozen neon snakes sank their fangs into her flesh. And that's the end of the chapter! Yep, another ending that made me scream right after the traumatic ending of the last chapter. And with that said, time for our first break, and we'll talk about the next chapter. Okay, we're back. And so to put it very bluntly, and pardon my French, but Gall's batshit insane. I'm going to read the first page of the chapter just because this is a really important moment in the book and for Coriolanus' overall character development, I feel like. So, time for dramatic reading. Clementia gave a blood-curdling scream, shaking her hand madly to rid it of the vipers. The tiny puncture wounds left by their fangs oozed the neon colors of their skin. Pus dyed bright pink, yellow, and blue dripped down her fingers. Lab assistants in white jackets materialized. Two pinned Clementia to the floor, while a third injected her with a scary-looking hypodermic needle filled with black fluid. Her lips turned purple and then bloodless before she passed out. The assistants dropped her onto a stretcher and whisked her away. Coriolanus began to follow them, but Dr. Gall stopped him with her voice. "Not you, Mr. Snow. You stay here." "But he stammered. "Will she die?" "Anyone's guess," said Dr. Gall. She had dipped a hand back into the tank and was lightly trailing her gnarled fingers over her pet. "Clearly her scent was not on the paper. So you wrote the proposal alone?" "I did." There was no point in lying. Lying had probably killed Clemencia. Obviously he was dealing with a lunatic who should be handled with extreme care. "Good. The truth, finally. I've no use for liars. What are lies but attempt to conceal some sort of weakness? If I see that side of you again, I'll cut you off. If Dean Highbottom punishes you for it, I won't stand in his way. Are we clear?" She wrapped one of the pink snakes around her wrist like a bracelet and seemed to be admiring it. So this is a really key scene because this is the moment when Coriolanus gets the lesson of not lying and how lying is a waste of time. And this is the same lesson we see him pass on to Katniss later in the trilogy. And this is such an interesting part of his character because normally when we think of villains, we think of them as liars or that they'll try to trick the hero. But in Snow's case, he's pretty much always honest with Katniss. He may hide things from her and try to manipulate her, but from their first conversation in Catching Fire, they just agree to be honest with each other, and that makes for a really fascinating relationship between protagonist and villain. So I guess we can thank Gull for that dynamic. So Gull likes the proposal and dismisses him because it's her snack time. And it's really unnerving how she just casually moves on from potentially killing a teenage girl, but yeah, like we've established, she doesn't care about people really. She's just, an agent of chaos. So, which also makes her a pretty cool villain. Like, she's very different from Snow, obviously, but again, really cool villain. And as Coriolanus is trying to get out of the lab, he makes a few wrong turns, and this next sequence kind of plays out a bit like a horror film. I know for the movie they won't be able to include every single scene, but if they do include this one, I think it will look really cool. So he describes as seeing a case displaying humans with animal parts such as talons and feathers on their necks and gills, and there are tentacles in place of their fingers, which is so creepy. And Coria realizes that the people in the cases are Avoxes, and they start crying out, pleading with him. And perched above them are Jabberjays, who naturally start repeating the Avox's wails, so it creates like this really horrifying echo chamber of their screams. And again, that would just be really cool and also horrifying to see on screen. And then a woman finds Coriolanus, scolds him for disturbing the birds, and escorts him out because, never mind the people, I guess. Then again, I shouldn't be that surprised because it's clear that in general, the capital really does view anyone who's not one of them as subhuman, including Avoxes, because to become an Avox means you were branded a traitor and thus not capital anymore. You're an other now. And time to read another passage where we get to see Coriolanus really spiraling now. So this starts at the top of page 116. Coriolanus made it down the street and around the corner before his legs gave way and he dropped onto the curb. The sun hurt his eyes and he couldn't seem to catch his breath. He was exhausted, having not slept the night before, but hyper with adrenaline. What had just happened? Was Clemencia dead? He had not begun to come to terms with Arachne's violent end, and now this? It was like the Hunger Games, only they weren't district kids. The capital was supposed to protect them. He thought of Sejanus telling Dr. Gall it was the government's job to protect everybody, even the people in the districts, but he still wasn't sure how to square that with the fact they'd been such recent enemies. But certainly the child of a snow should be a top priority. He could be dead if Clemencia had written the proposal instead of him. He buried his head in his hand, confused, angry, and most of all afraid. Afraid of Dr. Gall, afraid of the capital, afraid of everything. If the people who were supposed to protect you played so fast and loose with your life, then how did you survive? Not by trusting them, that was for sure. And if you couldn't trust them, who could you trust? All bets were off. Coriolanus nodded up at the memory of the snake fangs sinking into flesh. Poor Clemmy. Could she really be dead? And in that nightmarish way? If she was it his fault for not calling her out for lying? It seemed such a minor infraction, but would Dr. Gall place blame on him for covering for her? If she died, he could be in all kinds of trouble. So this, I feel like, is sort of like the beginning of the end of Coriolanus' ability to trust people. He's now disillusioned with the power of the capital, and it isn't as and he realizes that it isn't as absolute as he once thought, and truly grasps how fragile it is, and even tells Katniss as much in Catching Fire. And we learn in Mockingjay from Finnick that Snow got rid of both political enemies and allies if he thought they were a threat, and this moment is kind of the origin of that distrust in everyone. By the way, I have a little conspiracy theory, and because I wonder in the future after the events of this book if Snow ever tried to poison or arrange some kind of accident to get rid of Gall, probably after he graduates university or when he became president, after he essentially gets everything he needs out of her, because Gall is this sort of like, again, powerful like agent of chaos that no one can really control. And if there's anything we know Snow hates, it's that something he can't control. So I can fully see him in the future try to get rid of her. Anyway, moving on. Coriolanus goes to the capital hospital because he's pretty sure that's where Clemencia is. Makes his way to the emergency room. And as he walks in, he can hear Clemencia screaming, so at least we know she's alive. The doctor assures him that Clemencia will survive, since the antidote for the venom had been given quickly, though there may be some neurological damage. He also said that they often get patients who come in because of accidents in the lab. Wonder how many of those were accidents. As Coriolanus leaves the hospital, he passes by Clemencia's parents. As they come in, he slips away unnoticed because he doesn't really feel like explaining what happened. And kind of understandable, like, how do you say, one of the head game maker that's kind of in charge of all of his mentors is insane and just let a bunch of snakes bite your daughter, so yay. Awkward small talk right there. So the only person he wants to talk to in that moment is Lucy Gray, because, she's probably unlikely to repeat the story to anyone. And when he gets to the zoo, he realizes that there are more peacekeepers at the front gates, and they have been instructed not to let anyone in. He naturally pulls the mentor card. Some recognize him as the one who tried to save Arachne, and it's enough for them to put in a request to get an exception for him. And naturally, they have to ask Gall, and Corio even says he can hear her cackling from the phone, which is terrifying, especially after what he just witnessed her do. He is allowed in for a short time. As they walk through the now very empty zoo, Coriolanus can see trash everywhere, leftover food, and just trash from the fleeing, panicked crowd, and even sees a few abandoned pairs of shoes. And he says he sees rats and raccoons are foraging through the trash. Oh, I got junk mail. Lovely. So what was I saying? Oh, rats and raccoons foraging through the trash. Coriolanus sees rat poison tucked under the boulders and up against the walls, clearly there to exterminate the creatures, but the rats are clever and avoid the stuff. We then learn that there had been lots of rats during the war. Poison had been used, and during that siege, rat had often eaten the dead people off the streets. Lovely. And the people can't exactly feel superior to the rats, because we know from an earlier chapter some people had to do the cannibalism. When they get to the monkey house, Coriolanus is instructed to keep his distance. He's resolved to follow instructions since he doesn't want to give Highbottom another reason to punish him. He doesn't see Lucy Gray right away, but he catches Jessup's eye. He wakes up Lucy Gray, who had been sleeping next to him, gets up and walks over to Coriolanus, but she's not looking so good. She stumbles as she walks, looks disoriented, and she has a new bruise on her arm. And it's during this scene that we learn that Lucy Gray and Jessup are now officially allies. Coriolanus gives her a packet of crackers he got from the hospital, and she's going to give half of it to Jessup, naturally. And the two of them now sleep in shifts because of the rats, and likely as a result of the siege, they now have a taste for people. Yay! Again, I have a fear of rats, so this is like horrifying to me. So the first night, something bit Jessup's neck, and then Lucy Gray said that the previous night she felt something crawl over her leg, and again, that is a nightmare for me. So now we actually get another good moment of Coriolanus being a normal, kind of thoughtful person. Yay! If only he could stay like that his whole life, everyone would be better off. And this just kind of shows my very low expectations I have of them. I have of him. Yeah. Sorry, Corio. The bar for him is like down at the center of the earth. So he has the tact not to share his problems about Clemency in that moment. He's able to recognize that Lucy Gray's situation is currently much worse than his. Like, no kidding. It's has been since the beginning. Part of it, I think, also is out of guilt, because we know he does feel guilty about the whole situation at the moment. They both take a step closer to each other. Because screw the rules, everything's messed up already. Coriolanus tells her about people being able to send in food into the arena, so Lucy Gray agrees that singing for the interview would be a good idea now, because she could get something out of it. And she says it'll be better if she has a guitar to play, and he promises to find her one. She also asks if it'll be broadcast to the whole country. Coriolanus says yes, though he doesn't think it'll matter since people from the districts can't be sponsors. We know, like, from this reread, that she just wants whatever song she sings to reach some people back in District 12. But we'll get more into that when the interview happens. And time's up. Peacekeeper tells them they're too close, and as he's escorted out of the zoo, Coriolanus tells Lucy Gray that she matters to him, and this is kind of, again, a really like genuinely sweet moment. And it's too bad that he can't be like this all the time. And Lucy Gray tells him that she knows he isn't there for a grade, and she calls him a rare bird. Again, I don't really ship these two, but it's a shame that things end the way they do. More on that later. On his way home, Coriolanus sees Persephone Price. She's the daughter of Nero Price, the guy little Corio saw take the leg of a dead woman. I have nothing to add. I just wanted to mention that. So anyway, the chapter ends with Coriolanus realizing he needs to figure out a way to feed Lucy Gray because she's slowly starving to death, and she could very likely die before she even gets into the arena, so he has to do something very soon. Yep. So yay, not another chapter ending with something traumatic. So with that being said, it is time for another break. All right, we're back. I had a pretty eventful break. A team won the Super Bowl. I don't know who. I've already forgotten. Whoops. Had some tea, took my dog outside, and watched a little bit of Spider-Man 3 for whatever reason. Which, by the way, I don't know if this is no longer like a super unpopular opinion because recently everyone's starting to like Spider-Man 3 a bit more now, but I really like Spider-Man 3. Yeah. I think it's a bit underrated and it's not as bad as people remember. I think everyone's expectations were just way too high after Spider-Man 2, but yeah, I like the movie. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Ballad. So, chapter 9 is where we're starting. So, Coriolanus takes a nap as soon as he gets home. Hashtag relatable. Um, After all, he was up all night, and when he wakes up, Tigress wakes him up and gives him some soup. He finally breaks down and tells her about what happened to Clemencia. Tigress wants him to report Gaul, but what can he really do? Gaul is head game maker. She holds the power and could, twist events in a way to make it not her fault and somehow put all the blame on Coriolanus and Clemency, the victims in this situation, yeah, as people in power do. So instead, Tigress suggests Corio just avoid Gaul as much as he possibly can. And later, Satyria calls and asks Coriolanus to sing the national anthem at the funeral, and a couple more important things happen in that conversation. Satyria asks how his tribute is doing, and normally Corio doesn't complain or ask for help, but this time, because Lucy's Gray's life and his future are on the line, he's honest and tells Satyria about the tributes, how they're starving to death and will likely die before the games even start. So Satyria promises to do something about it. And we also learn that Satyria doesn't mention Clemencia throughout that whole conversation, so he and Tigress conclude that what happened to Clemencia is being kept a secret, and for now, he shouldn't say anything. Because, don't want to anger Gaul further. Ay, ay, ay. And the cousins then have a laugh when Coriolanus remembers that he can't really sing. But the grandmam, of course, takes this very seriously because, as we know, every morning she wakes up and sings the national anthem. She wakes him up at dawn the next morning to practice and repeatedly pokes him in the ribs to remind him of when to breathe. And anytime he makes a little mistake. Classic grandmam. And gives him a nice light blue rose to wear because it matches his eyes. So the entire student body attends the funeral and the ceremonies in front of the academy. Everyone's wearing black. Side note, Coriolanus says that everyone can be relied on to have black clothes ready to go because everyone had lost someone during the war. Small detail, but I think it was a nice touch to show the aftermath of war. The cameras and reporters are there. Coriolanus thinks all this ceremony is unnecessary for Arachne, especially because, partially she died from her own stupidity. Again, kind of low-key agree with, hence my tangent earlier about the Arachne myth. Anyway, Coriolanus is glad that he only has to sing and not praise any of Arachne's talents or virtues, since it seemed he mostly had negative things to say about her. And speaking of talent, singing is clearly not one of his. On page 129, he describes his singing as being more of sustained talking. And after that, the president gives a brief speech, one of the standard, how sad to lose a young life sort of speech. And then the funeral procession rounds the corner onto the street. And as this happens, Coriolanus wonders why the president admitted that Arachne was murdered by one of the tributes. And, he thinks it sounds like something that they would want to hide since it makes the capital look weak or whatever. Symbolically, a tribute murdering a capital citizen, equals the districts having some kind of victory over the capital. But that question is quickly answered. So a truck comes around the corner with a crane on it, and dangling high above them from the crane is Brandy's body. And meanwhile, the remaining tributes are shackled to the truck bed in a way that makes it impossible for them to stand. So it becomes very obvious that this whole display is just to intimidate the districts and to remind them of how powerful the capital is, that any act of rebellion or resistance will result in very harsh punishments, because, nothing like dangling the body of a teenager in a parade. Ugh. Coriolanus sees Lucy Gray in the truck, trying to sit as upright as she can, holding on to a shred of dignity, which, good for her. She's handling the situation better than I ever could. There's a, literal dead body hanging over them. I wouldn't be able to hold it together half as well as she is. And I'm not the only one thinking about this. Coriolanus wonders how he would do in her situation as well. But then he stops himself because he realizes that's something Sejanus would do. And honestly, if we acted all just a little bit more like Sejanus, then maybe the world would be a slightly better place. Corio, you were doing well with your last interaction with Lucy Gray, and you just took a few steps backwards. Just a few, several, I don't know. And side note, one of my fears, quote unquote, for the movie is that they cast someone that's too, this is weird to say, too attractive to play Corio, and that the movie makes him too sympathetic. Mostly that last part is what I'm afraid of. Because Coriolanus is not a good person. He isn't yet evil the way he is later in life at this point, but in general, he kind of lacks empathy for other people. Even now, like at this moment, he doesn't want to empathize with Lucy Gray, the girl he supposedly falls in love with throughout the books. He's just overall a selfish person. Fascinating character, but not a good person. And hopefully when the movie comes out, Sejanus is the one we're all simping for. Anyway, the funeral continues. Arachne's coffin is pulled by horses. Her family is riding in a chariot behind it, and they understandably look uncomfortable. Then Gaul makes a speech. Personally, I don't think Gaul should ever be allowed to speak publicly or have any power, but I am not in charge of this fictional country. Though Corio notes that she doesn't sound like a crazy lady as she talks, so good for her. Basically, she just says the games will go forward with more energy and commitment than before, and the 10th games will be dedicated to Arachne. Interesting. Highbottom kind of disapproves of the whole thing, calls it like excessive and in poor taste on page 131. And what do you know? Corio and Highbottom have that in common because, as I said earlier, Corio thinks all this was kind of unnecessary for Arachne. Afterward, when they go to lunch, Coriolanus loads up his plate, not caring what anyone thinks of him in that moment. But he also doesn't like it because his self-control falters in that moment and it pisses him off, and he blames Highbottom for that. Sejanus is miserable and can't eat. Coriolanus reminds him that he'll be reported if he throws all his food away. Again, that detail reminds me of District 13. And how different things are in the capital 60 years later. And another interesting thing in this scene is that Coriolanus says to himself that while he doesn't particularly like Sejanus, he doesn't want to see him punishment. Ironic! Ironic thinking about the end of this book. And that's all I'll say about that for now. So Satyria tells the mentors that they'll be giving their tributes a tour of the arena that afternoon, and that it'll of course be aired live on TV. They need to be seen side by side with their tribute so that they can show that they're not afraid or whatever, that the capital's still strong, Coriolanus can tell that some of his classmates are reluctant, but no one says no because they don't want to seem like cowards. And he then wonders if Gaul is hoping for another act of violence so they can have an excuse to punish the tributes. I have a theory. I have thoughts. I'll talk about that later in this episode. Anyway, Coriolanus takes the food that Sejanus doesn't eat and plans to give it to Lucy Gray, of course. He resents that half of it will go to Jessup, but figures that ultimately Jessup is a good investment and it will pay off later in the arena. Obviously, because Jessup is very big and strong and he can physically protect Lucy Gray. And that annoys me, because Jessup deserves to be fed whether he's Lucy Gray's ally or not. He deserves so much better. You know, if we're gonna simp over boys for this movie, I really hope Sejanus and Jessup are like the two main ones that everyone simps over, because so many characters deserve so much better. Except Coriolanus and Gaul, obviously. And Livia Cardew. So they arrive at the arena, and here are just some facts, descriptions that were given. So the arena is just essentially this huge amphitheater, and it has been built across the river. It used to be a site for entertainment like sporting and military events, and also hosted high-profile executions during the war. Therefore, it was a target for rebel bombers. Interesting. And now the amphitheater is battered and unstable and is only used for the Hunger Games, and it's never even cleaned or gets any kind of maintenance or care between the games. I guess they can't get anyone to clean it, or maybe at that point in time, because the games aren't as celebrated, it's just a very unpleasant thing, so no one wants to go near it. So the mentors get there, the tributes are lined up, handcuffed, and being closely watched by peacekeepers. The mentors go stand by their tribute. Lysistrata goes to stand by Jessup. By the way, like Jessup, Lysistrata is one of my favorite side characters in this book. And part of it is because I have this little headcanon that she and Tigris become good friends after the events of this book, but that's not relevant right now. So we learned from Corio's narration that Lysistrata is the daughter of the physician who treats the president. So this is like her connection that helped get her a mentorship. They say the mentorships were given to the top students and it was done by merit, but we all know that it was given to people who are children of capital elite. So Lysistrata has been working hard to try to connect with Jessup and even brought him some cream for his neck because she's a total sweetheart. So they make their way inside the arena. Coriolanus notes that they're using the entrance for poor people. LOL, you're broke right now, bro. So to get in, you need a capital token. And every time you put a token in the machine, there's this just voice that goes, "Enjoy the show!" And, kind of annoying because over and over again, it's like, "Enjoy the show, enjoy the show, enjoy the show." But, they have to put a token in for every person because no one can find the key. Typical. So, and a small detail to note, but the turnstiles can't go the other way, so it can't be used as an exit. So obviously there would be another passage to use as an exit, but this little detail just puts me on edge, especially because I'm rereading and I know what's coming. And it just makes this whole arena feel like a sinister and unsafe place. I mean, obviously it is though, since 9 other Hunger Games have already happened here. All the remaining tributes but one are gonna die here. So moving on. Coriolanus remembers that back when the amphitheater was being used, the Snows had a private box where they would watch the event, especially the military displays his father had been a part of. Everyone's a bit overwhelmed by the size and scope of the arena. Corio composes himself. Lucy Gray sees Lepidus and waves at him, but he doesn't wave back. And overall, it's kind of a somber atmosphere. The Capitol wants this to be filmed as a serious event of remembrance or whatever. For the tributes, this is just so depressing. Here, take a tour of where you'll very likely die in a brutal way. Coriolanus surveys the arena, looking for anything Lucy Gray can use to her advantage. And he decides the stands could be her best bet. I mean, there are tunnels, but those could be easy to get trapped in. And as the line stretches out, Coriolanus and Lucy Gray can talk to each other, and Corio tells her how awful the funeral was. He hated seeing her in the truck like that. And Lucy Gray says that they were fed that morning, so yay, his complaints to Soteria worked. And Lucy Gray compliments his singing voice, says it has real authority. I guess that'll be useful for when he's president. Though she naturally doesn't really care for the actual song. And now it's gonna be another reading of the chapter. Woo! Lucy Gray compliments his singing voice, and Coriolanus says, thanks, that means a lot coming from you, he said. She nudged him with her elbow. I wouldn't broadcast that. Most people here think that I'm lower than a snake's belly. Coriolanus shook his head and grinned. What? She said. You just have funny expressions. Not funny per se, more colorful, he told her. Well, I don't say per se much, if that's what you mean, she quipped. No, I like it. It makes the way I talk seem so stiff. What was it you called me the day at the zoo? Something about cake, he remembered. Oh, the cake with the cream? You don't say that? She asked. Well, it's a compliment where I come from. Cake can be pretty dry, and cream's as scarce as a hen's teeth. For a moment he laughed, forgetting where they were, how depressing the backdrop. For a moment there was just her smile, the musical cadence of her voice, and the hint of flirtation. Then the world exploded. Another WTF ending from Suzanne. So, naturally, good time to take a break, and we'll dive into chapter 10. Okay, update. I googled who won the Super Bowl just now, and it was the Rams. So, yay! Congratulations to the Rams. And if you're listening, I doubt any team members from the Rams are listening, but just in case, yay! Congratulations. And I watched a little bit more of Spider-Man. Harry just got his memory back, so stuff's about to go down. But anyway, back to talking about Ballad. So, chapter 10 has a very explosive opening. Ha 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 ha. But I'm hilarious. So Coriolanus quickly realizes that he can't run anywhere because the first bomb set off a chain of eruptions around the arena, and again, this gives some violent flashbacks to the war and being a kid during the air raids. And he also realizes that there isn't a hovercraft above dropping any bombs, so the bombs were planted there ahead of time. He and Lucy Gray cover their faces. He worries that all the smoke will affect her singing voice, and he thinks it's just as he thinks it's over. Naturally, there's another explosion, and this time it's right above him. It destroys what used to be the snack stand. A heavy beam lands on his back, and he's now trapped under it. And just to add to the bad situation, it's on fire. So, time for another reading. I know this episode is already long, and and I have done quite a few readings, but this is a really important moment, and it does deserve its own reading. It's on page 141. The fire singed his hair, and with renewed effort he tried to struggle from under the beam, to no avail. A searing pain began to eat into his neck and shoulder as the horrifying realization that he was burning to death overtook him. He screamed again and again, but seemed alone in a bubble of dark smoke and flaming rubble. Then he could make out a figure rising from the inferno. Lucy Gray said his name, then snapped her head around, something out of his view catching her attention. Her feet took a few steps away from him. Then she hesitated, apparently torn. Lucy Gray, he pleaded in a ragged voice. Please. She gave a last look at whatever had tempted her and ran to his side. So this is one of those very epic, I think, prequel moments. Obviously, we know that Coriolanus will survive, but he's still really close to death in this moment. So I was worried for a couple seconds, even though I shouldn't have been. And it kind of reminds me of that scene in the first Hobbit movie, when Bilbo has the ring. He needs to get out of the caves, and to do that, he has to get past Gollum to do so. And there's this brief moment where he considers killing Gollum right then and there. After all, Gollum planned on killing him earlier, and he could because with the ring on, he's invisible. Gollum can't see him, but Bilbo spares him. And I think about the scene between Lucy Gray and Coriolanus because, gosh, if only Lucy Gray had just let him die. And she very likely would have been shot while trying to make a run for it, but it would have saved everyone a lot of trouble in the long run. So anyway, she frees him and helps lead him away from the flames, and they both collapse onto the ground. And they're both naturally in bad shape. Coriolanus also has burns on his back, neck, and shoulders. Lucy Gray's hands are burned because, yeah, she saved him by lifting the beam that was on fire. Coriolanus then sees a clear path to the streets and hears some sirens, and he figures that some tributes must have made a run for it, and this is what caught Lucy Gray's attention before when she hesitated before saving him. Medics come over to them, but they only help Coriolanus. Lucy Gray gets peacekeepers shouting profanities at her and a gun pointed at her neck. So, add this to the list of other reasons Lucy Gray needs to go to therapy. And this scene, it makes my blood boil every time I read it because she literally just saved someone's life and she gets treated like absolute shit. Again, pardon my French, but it's true. Coriolanus goes to the hospital, drifts in and out of sleep, gets treated, and when he does wake up for real, Tigress and the Grand Mim are there. He tells them that Lucy Gray saved his life. Tigress isn't surprised because she can obviously see Lucy Gray is a good person, and even the Grand Mim can muster a compliment. She calls Lucy Gray isn't really district, which is, really high praise coming from her. And the capital is obviously very freaked out by the bombing. Everyone agrees that it was rebels. They don't know exactly where it came from. Like, did it come from the districts? Survivors of 13? People in the capital itself? Oh boy. So I have a conspiracy theory to offer in regards to the whole arena explosion thing, and that is Dr. Gall's behind it. It was Dr. Gall all along. Yeah, a year later, I'm still obsessed with WandaVision. But anyway, so this idea actually came from another podcast called Into the Arena. It's a Hunger Games podcast hosted by two lovely ladies, Holly and Emily. And if you're not listening to it, please go listen to it after you're finished listening to this episode, of course. But so in their most recent episode, they talked about ballad theories, and this was one of them. And I can believe this theory. Gaul wants the games to keep going. She wants them to stay relevant because she's insane and she gets joy out of watching kids kill each other. And what better way to do that than stage a quote-unquote rebel bombing, reminding the capital why they have to keep taking revenge on the districts and how horrible the districts are, so the games are a necessity in her mind. And like Coriolanus said earlier, she would want just any excuse to make the tributes suffer. So anyway, we learned that both the tributes from District 6 were killed, and along with their mentors, the Ring Twins. Anderson, one of the other mentors, is in the hospital. Gaius, again another mentor, lost both his legs and is in critical condition, and most everyone needed some sort of medical attention. We learned that Lysistrata is okay. Yay. She says that Jessa protected her during the explosion by throwing his body over hers. And this is a moment I really hope they show in the movie. Just like a quick glance at the background or something. It doesn't have to be like a main, like long, drawn-out focus or anything. I just want everyone to understand what a wonderful person Jessup is. and to be just as sad as I will later in the story. So Coriolanus then asks about Lucy Gray. Tigress doesn't know. All she does know is that Lucy Gray wasn't on the list of dead tributes. We learn that both the tributes from one attempted to make an escape but then were shot and killed. And the girl from two actually made it to the river, but she died when she leaped over the wall. And Marcus was the only one who escaped, so yay. Dr. Wayne says that Coriolanus will be released in a couple days. He also tells us that the tributes are being treated by a vet when Coriolanus asks how Lucy Gray's doing. Because the capital just straight up refuses to give people from the districts any kind of quality care and just wants to keep dehumanizing them as much as possible. Coriolanus gets some visitors, Festus, Satyria. Sejanus comes in with his mom's sandwiches. Tigress brings him fresh clothes to wear when he gets discharged. And then he gets a nighttime visitor. Dun dun dun! Clementia! Again, this is another scene that plays out like a horror movie scene. Clemencia's rambling. She says no one's been to see her, not even her parents. She's afraid Gaul will kill her, a reasonable fear. Then she reveals the scales on her skin. Pretty sure they match the snakes that bit her. Again, really freaky and horrifying image, but would also look really cool on screen if they included it. And, it just helps get the idea across of how horrible Dr. Gaul is. And eventually, two staff members come along and escort Clementia out of the room. And now Coriolanus is reasonably feeling on edge and doesn't feel safe in the hospital anymore. Next morning, Dr. Wayne checks on Coriolanus. He knows about Clementia's nightly visit. Assures him that Clementia will be alright. Venom has weird side effects. I know you're telling me. Her parents have been told that she's just quarantining with a contagious flu. The Ring twins' funeral is also happening that day. Coriolanus watches the coverage from his bed. And a recording of him singing the national anthem from the last funeral is played for this one. And instead of showing it on a screen, they have a holographic image of him projected to stand behind the podium. What are words? He's impressed with his performance and realizes how much he looks like his dad. So the effort for this funeral is doubled, and Coriolanus is okay with that because he doesn't mind the twins being praised because he clearly likes them better than Arachne. By the way, we also learned that the two tributes from 9 died of their injuries. The vet did her best, but apparently she requested to admit the tributes to the hospital, but her request was denied. Of course. Just another example of the capital sucking. Once again, all the bodies of the dead tributes are paraded down the street. The 2 from 9 are draped over the backs of horses, but the 3 who tried to escape are being dragged along the ground because they were deemed cowards for trying to escape. And the surviving tributes are in caged trucks. After lunch, Coriolanus is discharged from the hospital. Tigress picks him up. He has a hard time falling asleep that night. He's worried about Lucy Gray. He's embarrassed by his terror from under the beam and mortified about the idea of there being footage of her saving him. And the moments after when he was clinging to her skirts, because again, Coriolanus hates being vulnerable, especially publicly. And so the next morning, Satyria calls him and encourages him to go to school. There's another mentor tribute meeting. Interview night is completely voluntary now. The empty chairs completely rattle Coriolanus now. The reality of his classmates being dead sets in. Plus, he very easily could have been one of them if not for Lucy Gray. So in total, 8 tributes are dead, 6 mentors dead or hospitalized. Olivia is throwing a fit, demanding a new tribute since hers is dead. she's a future Karen in the making. Maybe that's why we all kind of despise her. Um, Lucy Gray looks better than Corio expected. The vet did a good job, but she can't even crack a smile, and I don't blame her. She's been through enough. And there's more to come. So I strongly believe at this point, like, she's really not performing. She's too exhausted, physically and mentally, because of all the insanity that's been happening, and she's likely, kind of been in survival mode since the reaping, and understandably so. But survival mode, like, it'll drain you like very quickly as well. All right, so one like final reading, I'm reading the end of this chapter because this scene is, I think this is the moment that like made me fall in love with Lucy Gray, so I want to read it out loud for all of you. All right, so we started toward the bottom of page 152, and I'll read to the end of the chapter. No, thank you for saving my life. He said it lightly, but as he gazed into her eyes, the levity leached away. Is that what you're telling people? She asked. That I saved your life? He had said as much to Tigress and the Grandmam, and then, perhaps unsure of what to do with the information, let it drift from his thoughts like a dream. Now with the empty seats of the fallen around him, the memory of how she'd rescued him in the arena demanded his attention, and he could not ignore its significance. If Lucy Gray had not helped him, he would be utterly, irrevocably dead. Another shiny coffin, dripping flowers, another empty chair. When he spoke again, the words caught in his throat before he forced them out. I told my family. Really, thank you, Lucy Gray. Well, I had some time on my hands, she said, tracing the frosted flower on a cookie with a shaky forefinger. Pretty cookies. Then came confusion. If she had saved his life, he owed her. What? A sandwich and 2 cookies? That was how he was repaying her? For his life, which apparently he held quite cheaply. The truth was, he owed her everything. He felt the blush burn over his cheeks. You could have run. And if you had, I would have gone up in flames before they reached me. Run, huh? Seems like a lot of effort to get shot, she said. Coriolanus shook his head. You can joke, but it won't change what you did for me. I hope I can repay you in some way. I hope so too, she said. In those few words, he sensed a shift in their dynamic. As her mentor, he had been the gracious giver of gifts, always to be met with gratitude. Now she upended things by giving him a gift beyond compare. On the surface, everything looked the same. Chained girl, boy offering food, peacekeepers guarding that status quo. But deep down, things could never be the same between them. He would always be in her debt. She had the right to demand things now. I don't know how, he admitted. Lucy Gray glanced around the room, taking in her wounded competitors. Then she looked him in the eye, and impatience tinged her voice. You could start by thinking I can actually win. Boom! Mic drop. Dude, I love this moment so much. Because, like the text says, this is the moment that the dynamic shifts. Lucy Gray, she truly, drops the songbird persona, and shows, the tough, determined survival side of her. And this is when she gets a bit more, agency in the story, and I honestly get chills reading this scene. It kind of reminds me when Katniss is in the arena and she finally gets her hands on the bow and arrow, and suddenly the dynamic between her and the other tributes changes, and she can play a more active role in the games rather than just always running away and avoiding everyone. And again, Lucy Gray shouldn't be underestimated. God, I love her so much. So anyway, time to start wrapping up. So with all that being said, we are at the end of the chapter. Woo! And the end of the episode and part 1 of the book. Woo! Yay! Round of applause. So, yeah, this was a long episode. If you're still listening, thank you so much. You get a gold star. So, next week, We will be talking about chapters 11 to 13. Exciting stuff happening, and there'll be another song. Woo! And so later this week, I believe the episode will be up on Thursday. There will be a bonus episode coming out where, surprise, surprise, I do another book tag, but this time I will have a special guest. So don't forget to follow/subscribe so you get notified when the next episode goes up. Follow the podcast on Instagram, and please feel free to send me your thoughts either about upcoming chapters or chapters we've already covered. Thank you again for listening, and have a great day/night, whatever time you're listening. But yeah, that's it for today. Bye!